Hello and welcome back, you guys. Today we're going to talk about GSW. That is gunshot wound. Gunshot wound trauma is obviously a major player in all things modern forensics. So today we're going to talk about some of the unusual characteristics of gunshot wound. They're really hard to follow as far as what's going on because they mix a lot of different damage types. Gunshot wounds are a unique mixture of blunt force trauma, and we've met a lot of blunt force trauma in the very beginning of this unit. We looked at blunt force trauma in that it gives us the radiating fractures and the concentric fractures. Those are the things that are going to follow through into gunshot wounds. So there's blunt force, there's sharp force in that it is a penetrating wound, often much like what we saw with the piercing wounds of the sharp force trauma. And then a last one that we have not really looked at yet, which is explosive force. Explosive trauma is usually, more than anything, caused by the soft tissue in the body reacting to the influx of high velocity penetrating blunt force, basically. So we're going to see this explosive force as part of it, which is very interesting. But keep in mind, it's not our exploding force like a fiery explosion. This is more associated with the water that's in the tissues. We'll talk a lot about that later. Gunshot wounds have a few characteristics. The first one is an entrance wound. Obviously, usually the GSW is going to enter or shatter into the bone in one way or another. The most obvious ways of looking at these, and honestly, a very common one, are GSW to the skull. And we're going to spend a fair amount of time on that. There are also obviously gunshot wounds to every other part of the body, but the skull is very telling in a lot of things. The gunshot wounds to the appendages, for example, to the arms or legs, are a little less telling. So we're going to spend a lot of time on the head, plus people like to shoot people in the head. It seems to be kind of a thing. So in that, we'll see radiating fractures, we'll see spall, and an exit wound. Now, I'll explain what each one of these things are, and we'll see a lot of examples of these to clarify. Okay, first and foremost, note that obviously the hook and the screw at the top of the head, those are put in to help hold this part of the head together. And that obvious cut mark around the perimeter of the skull is autopsy. So what we're looking at here is a saw cut. You can see at least 3 of them. Saw cuts used to remove what we call the calvarium or calotte of the skull, meaning the top part of the skull. And that's to get access to the brain. However, what we're interested in is right there in the middle, you can probably clearly see the gunshot wound right here. Now, with this, we can see a few things. First of all, there's the penetration. That's the hole made by the projectile. Next, we see this kind of shelf-like. Do you see how it's sort of at an angle here? This is called the spall of the wound. Okay? So the spall mark, and then we've got radiating fractures coming out. You guys see those? So these are very typical of a wound, but there's telling aspects of this. A lot of people would look at this and say, well, it's a small wound, and one of the characteristics of entrance versus exit wounds, entrance wounds are usually smaller than the exit wound. We'll see that quite clearly in the future. But spall, which I pointed out just a second ago, that chamfering of one side of it. You can see the inner table closes up to here. The outer table is blasted out to here. That tells us that this wound, although it's relatively small, is actually an exit wound. Spall tells us the direction of the projectile. So the projectile was coming from the inside, so it obviously went in from the other side of the skull, and blasting outward. As the projectile bulldozes all of this bone out of the way, the bone tends to spall. It tends to break away at this angle. Okay? We'll see a lot more of those later. First, let's talk a little bit about what guns are. Okay, smoothbore weapons with multiple shot. These are what would be our modern shotguns. Muzzle loaders, which are guns that do not have rifling in the barrel. Thus, the bore of the barrel is smooth. Okay? Smooth bore means it's not spinning the bullet. Things that are modern smooth bore are shotguns, muzzle loaders. This is the old-timey kind of Civil War-like gun, but they're still around. Muzzle loaders are still used in some areas for hunting, and people just collect them. Well, as you probably know, most murders are a murder of convenience, meaning you grab whatever weapon you have. Or some people will actively seek out to use a smoothbore shotgun in order to not get caught. It's true that the bore of the rifling in the barrel, which I'll explain what those are in a minute, they're basically spiral grooves that go down the barrel to spin the shot. And I'll talk about that in a minute. In these, the mass of the shot leaves the weapon initially as a solid mass, and then it splits apart. What I'm talking about is there's a whole bunch of balls in a shotgun. A lot of muzzle loaders would do this too. Some of them use single bullets, but a trick that people used to use a lot back in the olden days, and they still use it today for various things, is called buck and ball, where they would have a ball and then a whole bunch of buckshot in there with it. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Standard cylinder barrels of double-barreled shotguns, basically they're just cylinders, so it allows for the shot to diverge. Choke barrels, on the other hand, tend to have a narrowing in the end of the barrel or midway through that keep the shot kind of closer together. We're going to talk about what that does in a minute when we see the damage that it does. Okay, rifled firearms are the newer version. And by newer, I mean about 1860s. They came into average use. This is extreme rifling. We're actually looking down the barrel, a cutaway barrel of a cannon. But what you see, those spiral grooves cut into the barrel. Now, most smaller guns like a pistol or even a rifle will have 2 or 3 grooves cut down the barrel. You can see this particular gun has a lot more than that, because the difference is most rifles and pistols are good, accurate for maybe, I don't know, 500 yards, something like that. You can get a decent shot off, maybe, and then they start to spiral out all over the place. Rifles can go out to maybe a mile or more of accuracy. These are cannons, and cannons are expected to be accurate for tens of miles in some cases. Usually rifled firearms only use a single shot, no more of that so-called buck and ball that I talked about a minute ago. Okay? So now there's a single projectile that is being forced down the barrel at high speed. In so doing, it's a softer metal. The projectile is made out of a softer metal than the barrel. So the barrel, these grooves, will actually cut into the bullet, and the bullet will be spun. See how that spins? So it'll be spun very, very fast. This evens out the weight of the ball. Think about a football. When a quarterback throws a football, the football flies dead straight. The football is not balanced properly, perfectly. You know, there's laces on one side and no laces on the other 3 sides. So why does it fly straight? Well, because they even out that abnormality by spinning it. Throwing a spiral, same principle used here in bullets. If you spin the bullet, if there's a little bit of a weight difference on one side to the other, it won't curve in the air. It'll go straight. If any of you have ever fired a black powder muzzle loader, you'll note that just the round ball going down a smooth barrel, oftentimes the round ball will have a little bit heavier on one side than the other because the lead is inconsistent. And what'll happen is you'll aim a shot right at something and it'll shoot off to the side. It'll spin out of control. They do that all the time. Rifling keeps them from doing that. Modern firearms have changed a lot as far as what propellant they use. Back in the olden days, we used to use something called black powder. Black powder would create a huge cloud of smoke, and it wasn't a very efficient burning. In other words, a lot of the powder would stay around. It would turn into soot, which is causing all that smoke. Later, they started something called gun cotton, which was a little bit cleaner burning. Nowadays, we use something called smokeless powder. Smokeless powder is a very highly engineered powder, which basically, when it burns, it nearly burns completely. It leaves very little comparatively residue, and it's got, as the name suggests, very little smoke because it's not creating all that soot that we see in black powder. As a result, it's much more powerful. It converts a solid into a gas very fast. When it does that, the bullet actually has more pressure behind it. It's all about pressure. The bullet will be fired out of the gun at a much faster rate. We now have multiple round firing firearms, rapid fire. People confuse a lot of things like semi-automatic with automatic and fully automatic. Fully automatic are the ones like Rambo has. They go brrr, all right. The semi-automatic is every time you pull the trigger, it goes bang. So bang, 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 bang. It reloads itself. Conversely, older firearms or even modern firearms with older systems that use a single firing. For example, back in the olden days, you would have to slide a bullet down from the breech end, from the muzzle end of the barrel toward the breech, toward the back side. You shove it down with a poker, pull the poker out, and then light the fuse behind it, and it goes. Nowadays, they open from the breech side, thus it's named the breech, and put the bullet in from the back side, and it fires out the muzzle. You don't have to put anything in the muzzle. This is hard to explain without looking at a gun. You don't have to worry about most of this, but just know that the rapid firing is a technological advancement that just fairly recently came around. It was really invented by Hiram Maxim in the 1890s. It became much more commonly used in the 1910s, and of course, it became a devastating thing in World War I, where the tactics didn't keep up with the technology. Different types of bullets equal different types of damage. Hollow point, metal jacket, soft point, shotgun pellets of different sizes, and shotgun slugs. These are different projectiles. These are different bullets. And I'll explain what the difference is with the different parts of the bullet. They do different things and they're designed for different things. For example, a jacketed hollow point or a hollow point or a soft jacketed hollow point or all these things. What they're designed to do is bend outward when they impact something. Almost open, almost like an umbrella. The idea there to shove more tissue out of the way and create more damage. Conversely, there are things such as armor-piercing rounds, which are designed to stay together when they impact something really hard. So softer rounds are made to balloon out on impact and cause a lot of soft tissue damage. Armor-piercing rounds are designed to go through armor. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Before we get too far into firearm types, there are a couple of things I want to identify here. All the way from number 1, which is way over here on the end, okay, we've got bullets ranged roughly in size. These are bullets commonly used here in the US. There are literally hundreds of thousands of different bullets in caliber, size, which is roughly caliber, and type of bullet. There are incendiary bullets, there are hollow points, there are, there are bullets that fragment on impact. There are all sorts of types of rounds. Let me tell you why I show you this picture with its mind-numbing array of rounds. We do not, I Cannot emphasize this enough. We, as forensic anthropologists, never will look at a defect in a skull and make an assumption about the bullet itself. In other words, I will never say, oh, this person was killed with a 32, not a 45. Okay? I can say it's more consistent with certain things to help narrow it down. But generally, we'll never say one thing or the other because different types of bullets can do different things to the bone regardless of actual caliber. And we'll talk about caliber versus gauge in a minute. Incidentally, in case you're wondering, this one right here is the type of bullet that killed JFK. Just so you know. Okay, so what is a round? Okay, a round as opposed to a bullet. You've probably heard all these things. What does it mean? Here we go. Pretty straightforward. A round consists of a primer, which is usually in the center or around the rim of the casing, which is the piece of brass here that holds everything together. The primer is an impact explosive. When something hits it, it then goes pop. It doesn't pop much, but it pops enough to ignite the powder. This is our smokeless powder in a modern firearm, which is the propellant. Okay, this is all cased inside, get a load of this, the case. The case of the bullet is generally made out of brass or something similar. Some can be made out of aluminum, sometimes they're steel, sometimes they're a brass that's coated with something. But generally, most commonly, they're called brass because they're generally made of brass. It's a thin casing of brass. Inside the brass is the bullet. Now, most often these days, bullets are often encased. Here we can see a copper sheathing over what is a lead bullet. For the most part, bullets are made of soft materials because you don't want to damage the firearm when you shoot them. So the bullet has to be a softer metal than the steel that the barrel is made out of. Okay? So the bullet, when the primer is struck with the firing pin of the weapon, this makes the primer explode. The primer exploding lights the propellant. The propellant exploding turns this solid into a very rapidly expanding hot gas. The gas ignites, or the gas expands and forces this bullet out. The bullet is then forced down the barrel of the gun and out and on its trajectory. Firearm types. Slow speed single projectile. These were our old-timey, think Revolutionary War single projectile. That's where you take the bullet and the powder, you drop them down the muzzle, you ram it home with a ramrod, and then you bring it up, then you pull back the hammer the rest of the way, aim, and fire. You also have to prime the frizzen and all kinds of other things. They're very slow. The next is slow speed multiple projectile. This would be the same thing, except now we're putting in not only the bullet, that big round ball, but also little bits of lead, ball bearings of lead. So you're basically stuffing in a bunch of projectiles. This is our buck, which would be the little projectiles, and ball, which is the major bullet. Buck and ball was a little bit more useful because, as I mentioned, they're very inaccurate. So if you have a whole bunch of projectiles kind of spreading out in a direction, you're more likely to hit somebody than miss them. Then we had the slow speed rifled projectile. This is when they started putting those grooves down the barrel. This came about most commonly, usually around about the time of the American Civil War. And in that, we started rifling barrels for more accuracy with those inaccurate balls, which meant we could take a shot from much further away and it was much more accurate. There's still also, you'll notice all three of these are slow speed. These are using black powder. The black powder is what caused these massive amounts of smoke on a battlefield. Then we had the medium speed rifled projectiles. This is slightly faster. This is our gun cotton. Okay, this is when the black powder was replaced with a slightly more efficiently burning powder, sort of, that would then burn better and launch the projectile. It still launched it relatively slow, but it was faster than the black powder. Now we have high-speed rifled projectiles. What we're talking about here are your modern-day guns and firearms. There's also high-speed non-rifled multiple projectile. This is a shotgun. They're using smokeless powder, but they don't have the rifling down the barrel, okay? They don't have those grooves cut into the barrel, and we've got a whole bunch of shot coming out of the end. This is your shotgun that's shooting buckshot, birdshot, all kinds of different shot come out. Gauge versus caliber versus millimeter. This is something that confuses the hell out of everybody in the beginning. Millimeter is literally the diameter of the bullet. So if we go back to that previous image of the bullet, remember it's just the part that comes out of the end of the casing. That's the bullet. So 9 millimeter would be, the bullet would be 9 millimeters across. Okay? So there you've got it. 10 millimeter round is slightly larger than a 9 millimeter round, right? And a 5.56 millimeter round is smaller than both of those. Okay, caliber. Now this is back in imperial measurement. This is old school, meaning England when they were still imperial measurement. Caliber is the weight, caliber is the size of a bullet in percentage of an inch. So a 22 is 0.22 of an inch. It's a little bit smaller than a quarter of an inch. Does that make sense? Which would be 0.25. So if I have a 45 caliber, you can imagine it's 0.45 of an inch. That's almost half an inch in diameter. Pretty large. If I have a 50 caliber, it's half an inch. Does that make sense? Now, the only country in the world that still uses caliber is us, the United States. Everybody else has gone to millimeter. In fact, because of our NATO alliances and things like that, we, in most of our military, have gone to a millimeter. So a .223 bullet, which is just larger than a 22, it's .223. So here we have a 22, it'd be a 22 and 3/1000ths larger than a 22. .223 is pretty small. In NATO measurement, that's 556. That's 5.56 millimeters. Okay, so a 223 is the same size as a 556. The difference there is 556 is NATO, is international size, and 223 is caliber, which is used here in the United States. If you're a gun nut and you're yelling at your screen right now saying, nope, 223 and 556 are different, you are right. They are different rounds, only in that the 556 generally has a higher compression because they have a higher powder load behind it. The diameter of the round is the same. Okay. Oh, I have a typo here. Gauge is how, not how many of this projectile equal a pound. So gauge is really old school measurement. Gauge comes all the way back from the early days of firearms, and I'm talking 1700s on up through the 19th century. Gauge was very common. We still use gauge in things like shotguns. This is how many of a given projectile equal a pound. If it were a solid projectile, although they're often associated with multi-projectiles like shot from a shotgun. If you imagine, if I have a 12 gauge, 12 of them would equal a pound of lead. Does that make sense? 10 gauge, 10 of them equal a pound of lead, therefore it's larger. 4 gauge, 4 of them equal a pound of lead, therefore it's much larger. So a 12 gauge, a 16 gauge, a 20 gauge is smaller than a 4 gauge. It goes backward. The other two measurements are literally bigger is bigger is bigger. The gauge measurement, it's reverse. So what's in a shell? Now we've already met a round, which was that single projectile that comes out of a pistol or rifle. Shotgun shells are different. The reason they're called shells is because usually only the combustion area where here's the powder. So we've still got primer. We've still got a brass casing going to here. Okay. Then we've got powder. Then we've got a spacer. Okay. This is also known as packing. And then the shot. These are little ball bearings, also made of lead, which has been coated with copper. So bird shot, obviously made to kill birds, very small, but lots of it. If I have 12 gauge, that means even though there's hundreds of shot in this single shell, it would take 12 of these shells to equal 1 pound of these. Does that make sense? Whereas buckshot, now I have much larger shot. Bird shot, made to kill birds. Buckshot, made to kill deer. It's much larger. Buckshot will absolutely kill a human as well. These are much larger balls. There's usually about 15 to 30 of them in a given shell, depending on the size. Still, if this is a 12 gauge, 12 of these shells, the whole thing, will make a pound of lead. 12 of these make a pound. There's just more little ones, fewer larger ones. Okay? Then we have a slug, which is a single projectile. This is one big, giant, essentially bullet. Again with the wadding, powder, primer, casing. What do high-speed projectiles do? Well, they open up wound cavities. This is an image taken from, and I think we'll see a video in a minute, hopefully if it'll play. What we're looking for is, this is ballistic gelatin. It's a big gelatin slab. And the bullet has been fired into it from this direction. So big gelatin cube sitting here. We've got a bullet flying in here. Now the bullet will not only trace this thin little trace, that's the actual bullet. It will then, because of that explosive force that's coming in, remember I said the explosion is actually caused from the water that's in this soft tissue. So the water in this soft tissue will expand out, and it causes this big temporary wound cavity. This would be inside a body. It'd be like woof. So this tiny little bullet has created this football of a wound cavity, and then this tissue is the tissue that's actually torn apart. This is called the permanent wound cavity, and the rest of this is the temporary wound cavity. Okay? So you will have bleeding in here, but you'll have absolute destruction of tissue in this area. Let's go to the next slide and hope the video works. If not, I will insert a video. Okay, it's working. This will continue to play in a loop. So what we have, you can see the projectile come to an end right here. You see this? This is the projectile. That little bullet made all of that wound cavity open up. Look at how large this temporary wound cavity is. See that? Now, you'll see it comes back together and kind of splashing around. This is that gelatin. This is what they call ballistic gelatin because it's supposed to act almost exactly like human tissue. So this temporary wound cavity, which you can actually see bulges the outside of this, right? It's big. But then at the very end, this area here is ripped up, torn to shreds. That is your permanent wound cavity right in here. All right? So gunshots create a lot of different things in the bone, which is much more important for what we're talking about. So here we have that grape shot. This is actually similar to a shotgun shot coming out, except it's coming out of a cannon, so it's much larger. This hit this individual. We've seen this image before. It went right through the front of his skull, and you can see these radiating fractures. And remember, radiating fractures that come down and hit the eye orbit tend to skirt around it and then continue down. That's exactly what's going on here. So we have a radiating fracture here, another fracture here, and another fracture here. Very typical of that explosive force that the projectile is doing. It's like that blunt force trauma of the projectile added to. We'll see some other things happen. This is, again, showing typical entry and exit wound, and I think I have the after shot here on the other side. But here would be our entry. This is obviously into the back of a knee. This is the femur here. It's been cut off, but this is the knee joint here, the top of the knee joint. What you have here is a firearm that's blasted into here. Now, obviously, they've held it back together so you can see what it originally looked like and where the original wound looks like. But all of this has been blown apart. It's literally been shattered. However, on the other side of it, you can clearly see it's blown outward. And this is very typical of that explosive force. Now in bone, down the middle of a shaft of bone, we have the bone marrow. Now bone marrow, very similarly to the ballistic gelatin we saw on the last image, has that, it's a very wet, kind of spongy, gelatinous material, just like that ballistic gelatin. So what we're seeing is the water that's held in that type of tissue is creating this blasting force, this smashing force. You can imagine it like this. If you've ever been in a bathtub and you imagine slapping the water on one side of the bathtub, the water has nowhere to go. The water doesn't compress. It's not, liquids act very differently than a gas in that they don't compress. They just move. That's why hydraulics do what they do. So if you slap down the water on the one side of the tub, there's gonna create a huge wave that's gonna smack up against the other side of the tub. This is what we're talking about. It's basically a transmission of force, but it's going in all directions outward. Okay, so it causes that explosive force where you can see this perimortem bending that we had talked about, right? This is clearly bent outward. Look at that. That's because the bone is still soft, it's bendy, and there's all that explosive force coming from this little entry wound. Boom, it gets blown into this much larger force by that explosive power. Now, we talked a little bit about entry and exit wounds, but here we go again, and we'll explain how this works a little bit. Here we have an entry wound. It is what we would call a keyhole defect, and I'll explain that later, but essentially what you see is it kind of looks like an old-timey keyhole. This was created by the projectile coming in here, but it hits at an angle and catches this wall kind of edge on. So it penetrates here, catches this, and breaks off this little spur. So it does have a little bit of outward spall, even though it's an entry wound. Here we've got a first wound. This is probably the first wound. This is probably the second. It's hard to tell. There's no radiating fractures to let me know for sure. Then we have our exit wounds. Look at how much larger this is. Again, here the brain has acted like our ballistic gelatin, causing that explosive force. So the brain, just like the ballistic gelatin in here, explodes out in a much larger area. This is another keyhole defect. This is a typical image of what we would see with a keyhole. Here we have the entry wound. And as it comes in, it makes this nice clean entrance wound right here. And then it hits edge on to this bone that makes up the top of the eye orbit, which is the ceiling up here, gets caught on edge. So it breaks it out. And then back here, this little tiny inset you can see is the exit wound. So we have an entry wound, and then out the back, the exit wound. All right. It's difficult because they made this inset so tiny. You can just see the outward spall that we were talking about. Couldn't go without looking at John F. Kennedy. JFK, you'll often hear, in fact, all the time, you'll hear conspiracy theorists say, oh, he was shot from the grassy knoll from the front side. And I already hear there's already people seething at me. You're sitting in your chair right now and you're going, nope, it was a conspiracy. It was much larger than one crazy person. I know it sounds scary, but trust me, the Warren Commission got it right. If you're a well-trained forensic anthropologist or even forensic scientist, the Warren Commission was working with very intelligent people. The jackasses who make a website that think they've figured it out are wrong. I'm here to tell you. I'm sorry, gotta tell you that. But here it goes. And you're gonna see there's a lot more science behind this than what you may think. But those radiating fractures that you can see here, these tell us a hell of a lot. And I will explain how those tell us a lot and how that makes this absolutely the exit wound and this absolutely the entrance wound, because several things are going on here. Number one, the Mannlicher carbine, which Lee Harvey Oswald used, is a very high power rifle. I showed you that image of that bullet in the middle. It's a large bullet coming from a lot of power. It's a big chunk of lead going at a very high velocity. It's imparting a lot of explosive force. So what's happened here is, first of all, it penetrates the wall of the skull. Now, as soon as this penetration is made, these cracks are already there. They race all the way around. In many cases, this crack will get to the front before the projectile does. And that's what happened. If you look, this radiating fracture then follows this suture, then creates this. This is actually a concentric fracture in a way, in that it's concentric in the explosive force that's happening here. Now remember, large, high-powered rifle round hitting the brain. The brain is indeed a very wet, gelatinous tissue. What's that going to do? Just like your bathtub, all that energy has to go somewhere. It picks the easiest spot. What does it do? It explodes out. His brain virtually explodes out. That's what that big pink splash you see in the images. If you watch the Zapruder film, you see a big pink cloud. Though that's his brain. Almost all of his brain was emitted out of this hole from that explosive force imparted by the large projectile flying at a very high velocity. So what's that do? Well, remember these cracks, as soon as this was penetrated, these cracks formed. When these cracks form, they form a weak spot in the skull. What's that going to do? The explosive force is going to explode out of that. What's that going to do? His head, being on a toggle, that is his neck, is going to go, it's already bent forward, it's now going to fire, like kind of launch backward very quickly, which is another reason people think there is a bullet hitting him from the front. It's not. That is a reactionary force. You can actually set a skull on a chair. I've seen this done. This guy set the skulls on a stool and then tethered the skulls onto the stool by the bottom, by here through the foramen magnum. This is where the spine and the neck are attached, thus the tether. The head can't fly off, so it's going to bounce back and forth. That's exactly what it does. It gets all this forward momentum, then the explosion happens, and whoop, it reacts by going backward. Even empty skulls will do that, let alone ones with brains in them. It's been done 1,000 times over. Well, I'll leave it at that. This explosive force is very clearly shown here. By the way, Kennedy, when at his autopsy, literally had less than, as was described by the attending physician, less than 2 teaspoons of brain left in his skull at that point. Okay, range estimation. And I'm sorry for this drawing. It's literally the only one that shows all of these side by side by side. I don't know why. But this is explaining 2 different things. Range estimation and SPAL. So up top is range estimation. Here we have the muzzle, which is the scary part of a gun. Okay. If it is directly up against the skin, it will actually tear out the skin and leave little burn marks around the wound. If it's at close range, usually within a foot of the muzzle of the gun, it will leave these little black powder marks around the damage. It won't have that tearing, but it will have these little burn marks all the way around. We call it peppering. And then there's the main defect. And then at distance, we don't see any of that peppering. This is usually over, depending on the firearm and how clean it's burning, et cetera, this is somewhere between 3 and infinity away. This will not have any of that peppering or the ripping on the outside. It'll have a clean entry. Now, here's the SPAL best explained. Again, this is looking at a skull, and it also shows us our explosive force. So what happens is the bullet itself enters. It enters relatively cleanly on the outside, but then it's pushing this plug of bone out, so that breaks. And when it breaks, we have this SPAL. The SPAL goes in the direction of the bullet, and it keeps doing that. So now it's transferring all this energy to this brain matter in here, which is creating a large explosive wave, which the skull may be able to hold in. If it does, then you have just this little exit wound. It's rarely like that, though. It's usually this big exit wound, as we've seen. So what we see is the little entrance and still that SPAL. So therefore, on the outside of the skull, we see the SPAL on the exit wound, and the entrance wound looks relatively clean. Close contact. Here you guys can see the main bullet hole, radiating fractures, and here, you see all this? This is burning. That's burning from the hot gases leaving the muzzle. They're actually underneath the skin, so they burn the skull. The skin would have been on top of this, so the bullet makes the hole. Then, between the skull and the flesh, the gases push underneath, and it leaves this burn mark. This is a contact wound, meaning the muzzle was up against this person's skull. Shotgun wounds look very different. Remember we discussed how shot leaves a muzzle. This is our shotguns, right? So here we go. Do you guys see this little circle here? And another one right there? These are the pellets. These are the pellets. All the pellets together create a large hole. But here it gets even more exciting. Look at this. There's a shallow hole here, a shallow one here, and a shallow one there. Interesting. That means those little pellets flew out, and these guys weren't flying as fast as the center group, and they hit later at a much lower velocity, so they didn't actually penetrate the skull. Here's another interesting thing. Remember how I said with JFK's wound, those radiating fractures tell us an awful lot? It tells us what gets damaged first. Perfect example of this. Do you guys see this big hole? And here we've got a radiating fracture. Here we've got a separated suture, right, which tells us it's perimortem. But here we've got radiating fractures, right, these three. This radiating fracture radiates up, comes to here. This one comes to here. There is also a concentric fracture, you see it? Well, this radiating fracture coming up here, on top of that radiating fracture, we have this pellet wound. That means this fracture was from the first shots that hit. This one, a microsecond later, hit and put a dent, or actually a little nick, on top of that radiating fracture. So we know this pellet hit after this damage was done. And we're talking milliseconds, nanoseconds, okay? Then these radiating fractures tell us this is our entrance wound. Even though it's hard to tell, it's not a clean wound with a shotgun, is it? Even though we have these little pellet marks, which further confirm this is the entrance wound. But look at the radiating and concentric. Here's our concentric fracture. See, it goes around the same center as the initial injury, just like in the blunt force trauma. So we have this, we've got a concentric fracture. These two fractures meet here, which means they went through here, which means they weaken this area and that, just like in JFK. These aren't in a line, are they? This went in, created all this explosive force in here. It's got to go somewhere. Where is it going to pick? The area that's already been cracked here by these fractures. These fractures beat that there, create a soft area, or a weak area. Stop calling it soft. A weak area, which then blew out from the explosive force by all these shot with an extremely high velocity shotgun hitting the brain tissue, which then had to find a way out to relieve that pressure. And it finds the weak spot and blows out. So it actually went in the back of the head and blew out the top of the head. Here's another keyhole wound. Here's the entry wound. But you can see the curvature of the skull. So what's going to happen? It's going to hit and then kind of bulldoze out this whole area. So this is all broken. This is called a what? You remember? This is a keyhole defect. And what's it going to do when all this explosive force hits? Look, radiating fracture went down, around, and down, just like I talked about. Crack. Hits this, spins around, and comes back down. This bending, so we know it's perimortem. And look at all this explosive force. It opened up this part of the skull. This entire piece of the skull would have blown out from the explosive, not from this bullet driving through. The bullet drove through before this whole section exploded away from the pressure hitting the brain. So we have 1, 2 as far as damage goes. Okay, that's important to know. In fact, if we had more than one gunshot to the same head, we could see if there were several radiating fractures that stopped here. So let's say we had this shot here, and that was the first shot. Then we saw another one here, and the radiating fracture goes up and boop, butts into this one. We would know this shot would be the second shot because the radiating fracture stops at a fracture that's already been there. So it doesn't have to go any further. The pressure is relieved. Pretty interesting stuff. It's all about mechanics, really. So if you have any questions, keep note of them. We'll talk about them during office hours this week. Okay? See you next time.